Hey guys, this is Mr. Gregory. This is our next assignment. This question is 1.2. The question is, how did people experience the Middle Passage? Before I get into the question, I want to talk a little bit about what I'm seeing in the assignments that you guys are turning in. Some of you are just clearly going to Wikipedia, looking up, last time it was the Salem Witch Trials. All right, look up Salem Witch Trials. All right, that intro, let me just copy and paste that and put it in my essay. Guys, that's plagiarism. You can't do that. You can't just copy and paste what somebody else wrote and then pretend like you wrote it. They don't allow that. So that's plagiarism, number one. But number two, that's also not what I'm looking for. If I ask you what caused the Salem Witch Trials, I want to know what caused the Salem Witch Trials. You don't have to waste your time by telling me the Salem Witch Trials were a series of trials between 1692 and 1693 in Salem. I know that, and I know you know that. I want to know what caused it, and that's more important to me than these other minor details. Details matter sometimes, but it's only if it's relevant to our question. So with that last one and with this one, I just want you to answer the question and provide details to answering that question as needed. Quality over quantity. I want good stuff, even if it's a little bit of really good stuff, over just talking in circles and thinking that putting a lot on the page is going to impress me and therefore give you a good grade. You've got to unlearn that way of thinking. It's more important that you show me that you're thinking about it and you're being critical than just putting a bunch of stuff on the page. So that's important. The other thing too, guys, just put a simple spell check before you turn something in. I'm getting assignments that have tons of spelling errors, and it's in Google Docs. And Google Docs has a function. If you go to Tools and you hit Spelling and Grammar, it'll tell you what you misspelled. So just do that before you turn it in. I think there's this sense of not checking an assignment before you turn it in to me. It's not a great idea. Just check it. It's not hard. You can do it. And then last thing, if you didn't get a grade on it that you liked, just redo it. Submit it whenever you get a chance. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's get into the question. The question is, how did people experience the Middle Passage? This question is about slavery. As I'm sure you guys know, during the colonial period, when when Europeans came over and settled the New World, they tried to enslave Native Americans, and it doesn't work. Part of the reason it doesn't work is that Native Americans could not survive or were not immune to the diseases that white Europeans were bringing to the New World. Excuse me. The second reason is that a lot of times when Native Americans were captured and brought to a plantation to work, they would escape because they knew where they could escape to. They knew the land. They knew the territory. Africans, on the other hand, were immune to the diseases that Europeans had and brought to the New World, so that was a bonus for why to use Africans. And the other reason was because Africans couldn't really escape back home if you brought them to the New World. And then third, there was a market for African slavery. Europeans definitely stole Africans from Africa, there's no question. But there were Africans that were complicit in this, who actually sold other Africans to these European traders. And there was a slave market going on for centuries. And some people in Africa profited off this. So it's a sad chapter in the history of the world, in the history of the United States, but it's something we've got to address. And the Middle Passage refers to those slave ships coming across the Atlantic Ocean or coming up the Atlantic Ocean to England. And it describes that passage. And slaves were often chained at the bottom of these ships and had to make that journey. So what I want to know is what caused the Middle Passage. Excuse me, what was the experience like of the Middle Passage? How did people experience that? Not just the slaves, but the crew, the captains, the doctors. What was it like for them on that passage? So when you answer that question, include slaves, include the doctors, include captains, include crew in your answer so that we can know how everybody experienced it and what it was like. I think it's important for you guys as young Americans to know this chapter of your history intimately. You know, some of you might actually be American descendants of slavery, meaning your ancestors actually came over on these slave ships. Or not. I don't know. You might not know. But regardless, these people helped build America, and it's important that we look at how they came here and why we allowed such a horrible, tragic thing to happen in the first place. You know, we can't allow things like that to happen ever again. So let's get started with it. I have 5 documents for you today. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, but again, you should see them on the screen, and I gave a download for you to use. And again, when you're writing your answer, use these documents. You don't have to do other research. It's here in the documents, okay? And again, if you have any questions about these documents, feel free to email me, and I will gladly explain as best I can. Okay, so if you look at our first document here, it's a Portuguese textbook. Now, it's a textbook, which makes it a secondary source. Portuguese. Why a Portuguese textbook? Well, if we read, it says Portugal was one of the first European countries to engage in the African slave trade. Portuguese ships played a key role in the slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas for several centuries. The following excerpt comes from a Portuguese high school textbook. Okay, so important to remember that the Portuguese were early explorers who are some of the first to actually trade for African slaves. The development of the slave trade became part of the process of settling the American continent. In comparison with Indian slavery, they mean Native American slavery, the blacks had a better physical capacity and resisted better to the climate. 2 important factors to justify the successive waves of slaves that had left Africa towards America. The time between the moment the slaves were bought and when they arrived at port was very dangerous, not only for the European traders, but for the slaves as well. Revolts and disturbances occurred frequently. Crossing the Atlantic was extremely difficult for slaves. First, there was not enough room in the boats. They suffered from heat, thirst, and lack of hygiene. Even the whites had difficulty with these things. At the time, the European states did not recognize the negative consequences of these massive migrations. On the other hand, a new diverse cultural situation originated on the American continent that resulted from the multiplicity of mixed races and cultures. Brazil became the most expressive model of the process carried out by the Portuguese as it melted Indian, white, and black in a complex mix of ethnicities and cultures. Okay, so a couple vocab words in there. Hygiene, obviously meaning cleanliness, and I like that word expressive. Expressive meaning effectively conveying an idea. He was very expressive in the way he described his ordeal to me. I like that word. It's a strong word. So let's talk about what the textbook says here. It says, in settling the Americas, slavery was important. Why Africans? Well, they go on to say that blacks or Africans had a better physical capacity and resisted better to the climate. So in the first paragraph, that tells us why Africans. But that doesn't really help us with our question. Go to the second paragraph. What was it like? It says crossing the Atlantic was extremely difficult for slaves. Revolts and disturbances occurred frequently. So a revolt is when the people involved reject the power, reject the people who are in power, and they try to overthrow that. There's a very famous story of the ship, the Amistad, where the slaves actually overtook the crew, and they wind up in America. And I don't remember, I think they were allowed to go back to Africa, but I don't remember. But the point is, that's an example of them overthrowing the crew and taking over. There were disturbances, there were fights, there were people fighting for their lives, fighting for their freedom. So that's no surprise. It goes on to say, first, there was not enough room in the boats. No surprise there, and you're going to see in a moment how tight that was. They suffered from heat, thirst, and lack of hygiene. Yeah, I mean, the slaves are not brushing their teeth and combing their hair and going to the bathroom in the appropriate way. Heat and thirst is terrible, and it says even the whites had difficulties with these things. And then an odd note, it doesn't really have anything to do with our question, but I think it's interesting that this Portuguese textbook says, hey, one positive is Brazil. Brazil's an expressive model of the process carried out by the Portuguese because it mixes Indian, white, and blacks in a complex mix. Brazil is one of the most diverse countries in the world because it does mix Europeans, mostly of Portuguese, with some Italian and Spanish as well. And then it does mix the native people who lived in Brazil before, and then African slaves who came in. And if you look at the Brazilian soccer team, sometimes you see black players, you see white players, you see players who seem who have like a brown skin but aren't necessarily black or white. And Brazilians are very proud of the fact that they have this unique cultural melting pot in a way. And their most famous player ever, Pelé, is black. One of their most famous players ever, Ronaldinho, is dark-skinned. But then you have other players like Felipe Coutinho who are light-skinned. So Brazil's this amazing mix, and it's interesting that the Portuguese are sort of patting themselves on the back for saying, hey, look at all the diversity that came out of it. Yeah, but it happened because you brought slavery to the New World. So I wouldn't pat myself on the back for that. It sounds like the Portuguese are trying to make it sound good. So, okay, what can we take from this document? That the boats weren't big enough, that there were slave revolts, this was difficult for slaves to come over to the New World, heat, thirst, lack of hygiene, and that this was even tough for the whites. So keep that in mind when you answer our question. That's what you need to know for document A. Okay, let's take a look at document B, which is from a slave ship captain. Captain Thomas Phillips transported slaves from Africa to Barbados, those are islands in the Caribbean, on the ship Hannibal in 1693. The ship left the African island of Sao Tome on August 25th and arrived in Barbados on November 4th. The Royal African Company of London funded the trip. This is an excerpt from his journal about the voyage. Okay. There happened such sickening and mortality among my poor men and Negroes. Of the first we buried 14, and of the last 320, which was a great detriment to our voyage. The Royal African Company losing 10 pounds by every slave that died. The distemper which my men, as well as the blacks, mostly died of, was the white flux. The Negroes are so vulnerable to the smallpox that few ships that carry them escape without it, and sometimes it makes vast havoc and destruction among them. But though we had 100 at a time sick of it, we lost not above a dozen by it. But what the smallpox spared, the flux swept off, to our great regret. After all the pains and care to give the slaves their messes, keeping their lodgings as clean and sweet as possible, and enduring so much misery and stench so long among creatures nastier than swine, only to be defeated by their mortality. No gold finders can endure so much noisome slavery as they do who carry Negroes. We endure twice the misery, and yet by their mortality our voyages are ruined. Okay, well, before we get into what a terrible person this slave ship captain is, let's go over some of the vocabulary at the bottom. Mortality, meaning death, especially on a large scale. Distemper, meaning disorder or disease. White flux, that was a term that essentially meant diarrhea. Messes was a term for meals. Swine, meaning pigs. Gold finders, meaning individuals seeking wealth. And then noisome, meaning unpleasant. There's one other word in the second paragraph, havoc. That really just is a synonym for destruction or chaos. All right, so this slave ship captain tells us a few things. He says that most of his cargo, because remember, he doesn't view these slaves as people, he views them as cargo, died either because of smallpox or because of flux. So that tells us that these slave ships were ridden with different kinds of disease. And most of the disease was carried and spread by the slaves. And what choice did they have? They were, put on this ship. They were chained down. They couldn't go anywhere. They don't have many access to doctors in the way that we do. There were some doctors on the ship. And so, how did people experience the Middle Passage? They were suffering from diarrhea and smallpox. Diarrhea is not a big deal today, but it was a very big deal in those days, especially if you were on a ship in the middle of the ocean. It dehydrates you. It strips you of a lot of your minerals. It's just a terrible thing at that time. Today, it's not really a big deal because, you can drink some Pedialyte and go to bed and, sit on the toilet. But you couldn't do that in those days. So it was really bad. And then smallpox we've eradicated from the world. You probably took a vaccine when you were a baby to immunize, I don't think that's the right word, to give you an immunity to the smallpox virus. But at that time, there wasn't that. And so these things absolutely devastated the people on the ships. The captain's not a really great person because he laments, meaning he's sort of complaining about, the fact that he's losing cargo every time a slave dies, which just tells you he has no heart at all. He says, we lose 10 pounds for every slave that dies. When he talks about pounds, he's talking about English currency. They didn't have American dollars. The English used the pound instead of the dollar. So he's saying, I'm losing money here. He says, our lives, we endure twice the misery, and yet by the mortality, meaning the fact that the slaves can die, our voyages are ruined. This captain is not a very good person, which tells us a little bit about what it was like on the Middle Passage, in that, look, I'm sure the job that the captain had wasn't a good job, and I'm sure he was miserable, but I don't feel bad for him. He's not the one being forced to be chained at the bottom of a boat and then go be a slave in the New World. I don't feel bad that his job isn't going well. I'm sorry, I don't. I feel bad for these slaves for having to deal with these diseases. So how did people experience the Middle Passage? Based on Document B, these slave ships on the Middle Passage were disease-ridden, specifically smallpox and white flux, better known today as diarrhea, and that just makes for a miserable experience. Okay, so let's take a look at our next document, which comes from a slave ship doctor. Alexander Falconbridge served as a doctor, known as a surgeon on ships, on British slave ships during the 1780s. He later wrote a book, an account of the slave trade on the coast of Africa, about his experiences. The book became popular among abolitionists. Abolitionists are people who wanted to abolish or end slavery. And he later worked with the Anti-Slavery Society. These are excerpts from his book. The men Negroes, on being brought aboard the ship, are immediately fastened together, 2 and 2, by handcuffs on their wrists, and by irons riveted on their legs. They are then sent down between the decks. They are frequently stowed so close they can only lie on their sides. In each of the apartments are placed 3 or 4 buckets for human waste. It often happens that those who are placed at a distance from the buckets tumble over their companions because they are shackled. In this distressed situation, they give up and relieve themselves as they lie. Their food is served up to them in tubs about the size of a small water bucket. They are placed around these tubs in companies of 10. If Negroes refuse to take sustenance,
I have seen coals of fire, glowing hot, put on a shovel, and placed so near their lips as to scorch and burn them. The hardships and inconveniences suffered by the Negroes during the passage are hard to describe. The exclusion of the fresh air is among the least tolerable. The floor of their rooms was so covered with blood and mucus because of the flux that it resembled a slaughterhouse. It is not in the power of the human imagination to picture to itself a situation more dreadful or disgusting. The surgeons employed in the Guinea trade are generally driven to engage in so disagreeable a job by their financial situations. All right, let's take a look at the vocabulary at the bottom. Riveted. All right, it says, by irons riveted on their legs. That means metal bolted together. Stowed, put in a particular place. Shackled, meaning chained. Take sustenance, meaning eat. Flux, meaning intestinal infection that caused intense diarrhea, as we said before. And then the Guinea trade, just meaning the slave trade. Okay. I want to start at the end where he says surgeons employed in the slave trade are generally driven to engage in so disagreeable a job by their financial situations. He says, look, this job sucks. It's awful. But we do it because our financial situations are so bad, we don't have any other choice. That's really sad. It's really sad that we live in a world where people have to take awful jobs simply because the world dictates that we do that. Anyway, go to the second paragraph. He says, after he says they're stowed so close they can only lie on their sides, he says, it often happens that those who are placed at a distance from the buckets tumble over their companions because they're shackled, and in this situation they give up and relieve themselves, as they lie. In other words, they try to get up and go to a bucket so they can do their business, and then often they're so tied up and it's so tight they can't get over there that they just relieve themselves. They go to the bathroom right there. It's disgusting. And it's what we made them do. So what were things like on the Middle Passage? People couldn't go to the bathroom in a bucket even. Sometimes they would just do it where they were because they had no choice. When you gotta go, you gotta go. And I'm not trying to be funny about it. I really mean, like, this was a bad situation. Go to the third paragraph. It says, their food is served up to them in tubs, about the size of a small water bucket. They are placed around these tubs in companies of 10. If Negroes refuse to take sustenance, I have seen coals of fire, glowing hot, put on a shovel and placed so near their lips as to scorch and burn them. All right, so if the slaves refuse to eat out of this bucket, and I mean, just the image of that is like how a pig eats out of a slop bucket. If the slave refused to eat out of that, they would take coals, hot coals, and stick it up towards their lips and burn their lips and scorch them. That's torture. That's torture. And think about how bad and desperate you have to feel as a slave to not even want to eat when you're starving. So they would starve themselves almost in protest, or just it was so gross down there, there's blood and mucus and feces and urine. Who wants to eat in that circumstance? And then you refuse, and then they say, okay, well, we'll teach you. Let's take some hot coals and stick it up to your lips and burn them. I mean, it's just horrible. It's a horrible, inhumane thing. He goes on to say, the exclusion of fresh air was the least tolerable. Yeah, that's pretty bad. I mean, I don't like stuffy rooms to begin with. That just makes it even worse. He goes on to say the floor of the rooms was so covered with blood and mucus because of the flux. So again, because of diarrhea, there's blood, there's mucus everywhere. This is just a horrible, disgusting voyage. So, based on document C, how did people experience the Middle Passage? Based on this document, it was an uncomfortable, disgusting, inhumane ordeal where people were forced to sit in their own blood, mucus, urine, feces, and then they were punished if they wouldn't eat in those circumstances. It was poorly ventilated, and people couldn't even separate themselves enough to go to the bathroom. So really, really horrible stuff here. All right, so let's take a look at document D, which is a diagram of a slave ship. This is part of a diagram depicting the British slave ship Brooks after the passage of the Regulated Slave Trade Act of 1788. This law, which sought to improve conditions on slave ships, was passed in response to rising opposition to the slave trade in England. This document depicts how many slaves could be placed on this ship, with 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches allowed for each man, 5 feet 10 inches by 1 foot 4 inches allowed for each woman, and 5 feet by 1 foot 2 inches allowed for each boy. The ship could hold 454 slaves. Before Britain began regulating the slave trade, the ship reportedly carried as many as 609 slaves. So before the government stepped in and said, whoa, these are too crowded, they would fit as many as 609. But if you look down at this diagram, and you can zoom in, I hope, that's 454 at capacity. The fact that they managed to fit in another 150 roughly is astonishing to me. If you look at the lower deck, they're packed in there like sardines. They would separate the men, the women, and the boys. They didn't bring girls, and I'm sure you're probably asking me why they didn't bring girls. The reason they didn't bring girls is so that they could stay in West Africa, where they were getting these slaves from, and procreate. That's why. They also felt that the girls were more subject to being raped than the women. Not something to be taken lightly. And I'm sorry I have to tell you that, but it's the truth. So anyway, let's get back to this. If you go to the absolute bottom of the diagram, go to the bottom left, you can see the back of the ship, the levels that are there. If you go to the very bottom, there's just all the slaves on the floor, and then above them there are planks, almost like bunk beds, that they can sit on, or lie on, and just take a moment to really look at this diagram, because, to answer our question, how did people experience the Middle Passage? Especially in this era of the coronavirus, where we're all being told to social distance and stay apart from each other, how could you not get sick on this slave ship if you were a slave? I mean, you're that close. How are you expected to get up and go to the bathroom? How are you expected to have a moment's peace? It's got to be maddening. It's got to be awful. And you can tell just from looking at that. So, I mean, I don't have much to say about this diagram that we haven't said already and that you can't tell just with your own 2 eyes. It's a cramped, horrifying ordeal. Combine that with all the stuff we've learned in the previous documents, and document D shows us that not a lot of space given for these slaves on this journey. Okay, so let's end with document E, which is the autobiography of a former slave. Now, autobiographies are written by the people who the biography is about. They don't get another author to write it about them. What's interesting about this is that this slave must have learned to read and write at some point, which is odd because slaves were often not taught how to read and write. Part of what white slave masters wanted is to keep slaves ignorant, which is why I think it's very important that we all value education, because education is power, and the slave masters knew that education was power, so they tried to withhold education from them. So, I think there's a lesson in that for all of us, and that ignorance is not a good idea. I don't want to learn that. That's too much work. Don't make me think. That's what people in power want, is for you to think, to be ignorant. And slaves learned that, hey, education is power. The more we learn, the more we know, the more that's a weapon, the more we can utilize that. And that's true for everyone.
wasn't just true for the slaves. That's true for everyone. So I think it's important to recognize that before we start. Anyway, Olaudah Equiano was born in West Africa. As a young boy, he was kidnapped by an African tribe and sold to European slave traders who took him to Virginia. He eventually purchased his freedom and moved to England, where he became active in the abolition movement. He later wrote an autobiography describing his experiences as a slave. Recently, a historian located evidence indicating that Equiano was actually born in South Carolina. However, other historians maintain that there's strong evidence corroborating Equiano's account. That word corroborating is really important. That's when multiple stories match up. And so it sounds like Equiano is telling the truth because lots of other stories corroborate what Equiano is saying. Other stories match up to what he's saying. That's a really strong word, corroborate. We use that a lot in history. Moreover, this is one of the only accounts of the Middle Passage from the perspective of a slave. These are excerpts from Equiano's autobiography. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a smell in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. But soon, to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me food, and, on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across, I think, the windlass, and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before. So before we go on, let's look at our vocab. Loathsomeness meaning unpleasantness. Windlass is the machine used to raise the anchor of the ship, and then flogged means whipped. So if we replace that in that last sentence, I think the machine used to raise the anchor and tied my feet while the other whipped me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before. The crew used to watch us very closely who were not chained down to the decks, in case we would leap into the water. And I have seen some of the poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. This indeed was often the case with myself. I feared I should be put to death, and white people looked and acted, as I thought, in so savage a manner, for I had never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty. And this not only shown towards us blacks, but to some of the whites themselves. One white man in particular I saw when we were permitted to be on deck, flogged or whipped so unmercifully that with a large rope near the foremast that he died, and they tossed him over the side. This made me fear the people the more. This is really sad. And Olaudah Equiano wrote this in 1789, and his story corroborates some of the things we've already heard. He basically says, they beat me. I was sometimes offered food. I refused to eat. I'd never seen people behave like this before. Sometimes slaves, when they weren't chained down, would leap into the water. I mean, that's basically committing suicide. I mean, you're in the middle of the ocean, and a lot of people at that time could not swim, so some of the slaves would rather commit suicide and die, quote, free, than die in chains on that ship or wherever they were going. And then he said, if they were caught trying to do this, they would be cut, whipped hourly. He even says that one white man was whipped so unmercifully, that he died and then was tossed over the side. So, according to the perspective of a slave, how did people experience the Middle Passage? They would try to commit suicide. They were whipped when they tried to do that. They were whipped when they would not eat. And this even happened to one white man, too. This wasn't exclusive to the African slaves that were there. So now what I want you to do
is take everything we've read and everything we've learned, and I want you to answer the question, how did people experience the Middle Passage? And you have tons of examples. If you go through documents A through E, you have tons of examples to answer this question. And so read the assignment on Google Classroom, do the best you can, and again, I'd want to see you, reference these documents. Use these documents. You don't have to do outside research. Reference these documents, all the information's here, and give me a good answer that tells me, how did people experience the Middle Passage? All right, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them on Google Classroom or email me at james.gregory@lausd.net, and I look forward to reading your answers. Guys, I know this is so sad and negative, but we have to face history. Can't run away from it. If we don't want to make the mistakes of the past, we have to learn our history, face it, and then try to move forward and be better in doing so. I hope you guys learned a lot today. I know it's sad, but you guys, in learning it, can help shape the future.